I find a lot of the issues around consultation comes down to the dispositions of individuals you're dealing with. Policy just seems to be so chaotic sometimes that no one knows where they're going. They don't have a clue, don't understand, but the treaties are very clear. And when you try to explain that clearness in the treaties of what they mean and how it means full inclusion of all people, not just First Nation people, but all people, because that's why the treaties were signed. The treaties were signed, number one, protect our people, but at the same time, create full inclusion for everybody.
And there was no consultation. There was just the gun. That was the that was the consultation. Was the gun. And now today is they're actually listening to us. They actually ask us what we think instead of the gun. And it wasn't that long ago.
My experience with consultation, I've noticed there's been a lot of challenges, both on the federal level, the provincial level, and with the proponent. Most recently, as Betty said, things do seem to have somewhat improved, but there still is a struggle in areas in which the process isn't a clear process. That hasn't yet been defined. The government would like to define that for us and tell us how they would like to see that process unfold. There appears to be different trigger points for different proponents, different government departments when the consultation process is actually initiated, which seems to be a problem. You know, we expect to be consulted at the very beginning of all of the processes. So, and we're talking about everything under, you know, we talk about our treaty rights and we really have a full box of tools there. So almost everything that we do, we can almost relate it back to our treaties, and in some area it's going to fit in there. So, you know, in order to ensure the protection and the implementation, we have to ensure that proponents and governments are properly consulting with us. So some of them, proponents seem to be some of them that have worked in other areas across the country and are now coming east. They seem to have a little bit more clear understanding, but it's difficult because the provincial government doesn't seem to quite be moving at the same pace with them. So they're ready to go, but the government's not quite there yet.
We've made some improvements, and I think that building on those main points and where we're at, I think we're going in the right direction, and I hope that we can still go in that direction. But there's many things that you could pinpoint and say, well, we could do this, do that better. But I guess in the general scheme of things, I really think that I think that the other federal and provincial, I think the eyes are being opened, maybe not as fast as we would like it, but I think that it is baby steps, but you have to kind of see the bigger picture of what we're trying to do and not to get frustrated when little things do get out of whack. And I think that with respect on both sides and trust and transparency, I think that that's what we promote on our side, and I think the proponents and departments, I think they see it too, and I think that it's definitely a two-way street. Maybe not fully yet, but like I said, I like to be positive, so I think that we are getting there.
Just to touch on what Tracy Ann and Olivia both said about how the process is today and how the process was back in the day when my dad was chief. There was no process then. I remember, and there was the only programs that I remember were just basic, the forestry, the fisheries. My dad and them didn't even have a band office. So it was just forestry and fisheries. So when a dispute took place, there was no consultation. And the dispute that I want to touch on a little bit was a fisheries dispute that Metabenaghiak had, where the federal government told us that we didn't have a right to fish, and our men would set their nets every night. So what had happened, I would have been about 10 years old. Again, so what happened was there was a big raid in Red Bank. DFO sent all their fishery officers, policemen, everybody was on that river, and there was back and forth, there was rocks thrown. That's the only communication that there was rocks and weapons or whatever. But I think about that, and even though they still managed, so the next day after all this happened, they knew they were in a sort of a crisis situation, and DFO and the government, they came to Red Bank and met with my father and Mike Guinness at the time. Mike Guinness was chief of Vilgram and the council in Red Bank. So this happened at the church hall in Red Bank, and they all went into the meeting in the church hall, and they couldn't reach an agreement about, the chiefs insisted that we had rights. This is our right and we're going to fish. DFO said, no, you're not. The government said no. So my father said, okay, this is what we're going to do. He said, I'm locking both of the doors. He said, nobody is leaving this room until we reach an agreement. That's how they operated back then. So the government officials, there was no phones back then, there was no faxes, there was no way of dealing with or getting in contact with Ottawa. Like today we would pick up the cell phone, and if we knew somebody would send them off a quick text or a message, and things would happen more quickly. So the priestess house was right beside the church hall. So the government officials had to go to the priestess house and use the telephone to call Ottawa. That's what they did. They called Ottawa, and that's when we got our 12 stand nets, and Ilground got their 12 stand nets. But that's how it was. That's how it was, and I'll never forget that as a child. That's deeply ingrained in me. And when I look back and see everything that's happened since then, all the programs, it's been slow. It's been slow. It's been really slow, but we're finally at a point where, like I said before, I feel comfortable with organization, with the organization, with Mi'kmaq Tplu'taqnn and the chiefs and their support staff. They are making sure that things are going to be done properly now.
One good one that we've been really experiencing is small craft harbors, and we've been working really close with their staff, and they have been very, whenever we it's, I guess you don't feel the pressure, and it feels very genuine, and maybe I'm naive, but like I said, I like to be positive, and I really feel, just from different meetings, and I'm all about vibes, and I feel that we're heard when we sit down and speak to them, and that they really do see where, I guess there's no hesitation in whatever we have ever needed, and even beforehand, and I noticed that it's come right there, and they've given us a heads up, so we kind of knew with certain projects that we did, we knew that things were going to come from November. We knew things were coming, and with that, I mean, they didn't have to give us a heads up, and they didn't have to really go into detail, and they could have done what a lot of people do, and it's last minute. And I mean, anyone can do that, but I really appreciate the fact that not only did they do things, they've learned a lesson, but I think they've done things early, but they not only have they done it early, but they've even done it before anything. You know what I mean? If that even makes sense. Like, they've said 15, for an example, like they're talking about different sites and locations, and we were only supposed to be talking about one site. However, they knew that they were going to be talking to us in February, March, and coming down the line. So we got a list, and we got to be able to prepare ourselves a little bit more in knowing what's going to happen. in the long run. And I think with that, it's made, we're not done, we're nowhere near, but it's made that process a lot easier, and I can see the difference with dealing with that certain file in comparison to other ones, where you do see there's gaps and you kind of, some you do have to follow and chase to see where they're at. And like I said, I just really appreciate and I respect the fact that they see, you know, I'm one person that believes that you've got it, it's two-sided, I mean, it's 50-50, you have to work together. And I appreciate the fact that they see on our end that we want to work together, but they do try on their end too.
For me, sometimes it's about getting the right people at the right place at the right time, and everyone has conflicting schedules, so it's not always easy to get everybody in the room at the same time. And then getting there, and there are things that, like the Indigenous knowledge study, and some of the, like the windmill projects, for example. You know, we can't afford a study of that size, but then you see that in Nova Scotia, they have that baseline study, and apparently that helps make it a little more affordable. We don't have that here in New Brunswick, and it's very unfortunate, because I think it would help the process somewhat, or a lot, I should say a lot.
You mean the baseline study?
Yes, I think it could be very helpful with all these smaller based projects. Another, I find another problem that we have too is what they determine is that low impact. It's not, like, what they're saying is not the same thing as what we're saying. So when do we engage? Early engagement is the key. And a lot of times with these smaller projects too, they're coming in and we're telling them, like, you need to do a case study, but they're already this far into the process. You know, early engagement is key.
There's been some really interesting work going on in some communities here in Nova Scotia around Indigenous knowledge studies. One community is doing their own right now with respect to a proposal for, I forget the exact industry, I think it's gold mining or some project. But you know, they're really noticing the difference between what the company has put out as here are the impacts versus what the Mi'kmaq through their own use study is. And the thing that's really wonderful, my friend is telling me a lot about this, but you know, if you go out one day of the year and say, oh, we didn't see any moose, right? Well, what time of year was it, right? And, you know, where was it moose season? And Mi'kmaq have so many stories and because they, about, you know, they have laws and stories, and you know, they've used the land so they can bring so much richness to informing like how a project is going to impact a place, more than just having some scientists go and say, oh, you know, we counted this many moose on this day, or any other species or animals. Gerald Glode, who was telling me this story basically, but that, like, you know, when they were doing some of this land use stuff, that Mi'kmaq have these rules around when you go swimming, right? You don't go swimming until, I think it's July 1st, right? Because the idea in Mi'kmaq, like I said, of ecological knowledge is that that is time for other species to use the water. And he was using that to sort of juxtapose whenever they went out for Alton to do some of the studying, like they didn't study it at the right times, and at that time there might not have been spawning, but it's just, I don't know. It's such a rich area to bring, and it hasn't been used very much yet, but like, you know, we know how the land has been used for centuries upon centuries, and you know, our language, our stories, how we've used the land tell us so much about how other creatures and life forces have used that area, and that really needs to go into sort of the planning and how projects are going to go forward and planning and whether they go forward at all, right? And that's a change that we need to see. But right now, sometimes these consultations don't take into account any of that stuff. They just go meet a group of people for, you know, an hour or two, and do you want this project or not? And there'll be good economic benefits without getting into, well, how did you use it? And what do your stories say? And what does your language say about that?
Well, and I think that the Indigenous knowledge studies are a really good example of knowledge transfer, right? It's an opportunity for people that know the land to be able to document and to express, you know, like the usage. And it's not limited to just like site-specific things always, like that general knowledge that we have. And I think that when you're talking with people and trying to educate about the level of knowledge we have about our territory, they're thinking very, very narrowly about it because we haven't been in a position to share our stories,
Absolutely.
to share our usage, and not be worried about how that's going to come back and the ramifications on it.
Yeah.
You know, back to that idea that we were always having to defend what we
Yeah.
were doing all the time. So for me, again, reconciliation would be that we're in a position now where we can share, we can teach, we can explore, we can demonstrate the diversity of our culture, why we're
Yeah.
different, right? What makes like Ulnu on our territory, and those Indigenous knowledge studies are they can have a role to play in the courts, they can have a role to play with government, but I think it's really that education piece, just to demonstrate how good our science is, how good our knowledge is, and how well people know our territory.
And I should say, you know, we've started here at the law school to bring in some knowledge keepers, and we have some courses now that we bring people in and the students here. And, you know, it's encouraging to see that they are hungry for this knowledge. We had somebody coming in talking about Mi'kmaq language and how, you know, various differences between it and English and what it says about what we know about the land and how we relate to each other and other animals. And the students were just question after question. They were, and you know, so people want to know this stuff. They're interested, at least in the students that we've had here. And I think, yeah, there's an appetite, and we haven't had a lot of opportunity, right? So I think that if we give people the opportunity to learn about this stuff, they will learn that we have so much to offer about how we can live here together and treat the land and treat each other.
But we do have to change as well how education takes place.
Mm-hmm.
Because our culture, our language, who we are as Mi'kmaq, like it arose from the land.
Absolutely.
So you can't teach in isolation from the land.
No.
Right? And that's why the land struggles have been so critical, because that's the grounding, that's the foundation of our laws. So if you want to demonstrate the law to people, you have to demonstrate the land, you have to demonstrate the usage, and people are not used to thinking about cycles the way that they once were. You know, like if you have a 45 to 50 year cycle just for birch harvesting, it's going to take patience for people if they truly want to get the knowledge and to share it and to teach it and things. And so it is that shift, but it ties in with that long-term relationship building, right? That this is not something that's just going to get done and move on. It's going to be, it's here.
Yeah.